Welcome everybody to a celebration of the 2022 Joyce Carol Oates Prize and our wonderful new recipient, Lauren Groff and Joyce herself. I'm Joe Prisco. We have people hanging from the figurative rafters today, so be careful out there. And thank you for being here, even if you're one day early for Cinco de Mayo. We have a conversation with Joyce and Lauren coming up, and considering these eminences, mine is the easiest job in the world, just getting out of the way. The comment box will be open, as you will see, and later on we will open up the Q&A box and field as many questions as we can. We thank Penguin Random House for generously sponsoring this event. Penguin Random House is committed to publishing great books, connecting readers and authors globally, and spreading the love of reading. It brings literary culture to life, by which I mean they create the circumstances for celebrating arts and artists, ideas and knowledge. In other words, the hopes of a literate democratic society. One of their indelible imprints is the marvelous Riverhead Books, publisher of Lauren Groff, and last year's winner, Danielle Evans. We humbly thank Penguin Random House for their ongoing support. Some background. The New Literary Project is a nonprofit created in 2016 in collaboration with the University of California, Berkeley English Department, along with artists and altruistic community leaders. We are sustained by our anchor donors, Simpson Put Something Back Fund, System Property, Wood Family Foundation, and Patty James, in addition to many other generous donors and family foundations. We are honored by your trust, and thank you one and all. New Lit invests in readers, writers, students, and teachers, and we do our part to drive social change and unleash artistic expression. We're the home of the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, the annual $50,000 prize to a mid-career author. Simpson writing workshops offered at no cost at places like Juvenile Hall, Girls Inc., Alameda County, and elsewhere. Simpson Fellows from Berkeley who lead the workshops. Jack Hazard Fellows, Summer Fellows, ships for creative writers who are high school educators, and Simpsonistas, Tales from the New Literary Project, our annual internationally distributed anthology of project-related authors, including in volume 4, which comes out in October, Lauren and Joyce. I also want to acknowledge our co-producers, the Busby Group and Book Trib, for all they did to make our event possible. And let me single out New Lit's marquee partner, the English department at the University of California at Berkeley, and in particular, Professors Ian Duncan and Fiona McFarlane, the terrific author, for their brilliant and kind support. And now for the show. It is a particular delight to not introduce two much loved and much celebrated writers, because really, this time the cliche is spot on. They need no introduction. Even so, a couple of words. Joyce Carol Oates. Joyce Carol Oates is Joyce Carol Oates. But let me call out her Substack, which is a marvelous new invention of hers, where she writes about therapy animals, and today a fresh offering about the boxer Mike Tyson, titled The Terrible Beauty is Born. And after reading her self-interview on Substack, where she asks herself one sly question after another, only a fool would dare to interview her, which is where I come in. Okay, a very recent book of hers is titled Breathe, and her forthcoming novel in August is Babysitter from Knopf, a division of Penguin Random House. And a warm welcome to Lauren Groff, previously winner of the prestigious Story Prize and other laurels, author of most recently Fates and Furies, Florida, and Matrix, published by Riverhead and edited by Sarah McGrath. She will be in brief residence at Cal during October. She is the 6th recipient of the prize, succeeding such worthies as T. Geronimo Johnson, Anthony Mara, Layla Lalami, Daniel Mason, Danielle Evans. In that vein, I want to give a shout out to all the tremendous authors who are on our long list, and you can find them on our website, and with a special word of praise and appreciation for the other finalists. Christopher Beha, author of The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, Percival Everett, author of The Trees, Katie Kitamura, author of Intimacies, and Jason Mott, author of Hell of a Book. So, my first question, Lauren and Joyce, here goes. As you reflect on your careers or other authors' careers, now or in the past for that matter, how has recognition, such as winning prizes or best-selling, maybe, I don't know, a Barack Obama endorsement, how has that mattered to you personally, to other careers, to vacations, to relations with editors and publishers and marketers, and or to the day-to-day life of writing? Joyce, why don't we begin with you, Joyce? You got to unmute, Joyce. Joyce, you have to unmute. You're still muted, Joyce.
I think you can hear me now.
Yes, lovely.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of excitement in this room because my two cats are rushing around like crazy. They're very excited at the thought of a Zoom interview with such a distinguished writer. Oh, well, I sort of don't like to talk too much about myself when we have Lauren here. She's the person that we're celebrating. So I guess that I think that I remember John Updike saying it doesn't matter how much you've published and how old you are, really, that you do want some sense of people reading your work and liking it, and getting an award, even being nominated and being on a long list, I think is just a little bit of a boost, you know, for one's morale.
Lauren, what do you got to say?
I would absolutely agree. But before I go into this, I would just like to say what a delight it is to be on this Zoom call with Joyce Carol Oates. I have to say, the first summer of the pandemic in 2020, I was profoundly depressed, as I think everyone was. And I read Blonde, which I've had on my shelf for, I don't know, 20 years now. And it just felt like falling into a companionship with an incredibly brilliant friend. And that's what you want from literature, right? You want this feeling of not being alone and not being lonely. So thank you, Joyce, for everything, but also for that moment pulling me out of my deep, deep depression at that time.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful.
Oh.
I probably needed something like that to pull me out of my similar depression. I think that we sometimes feel that what we're doing is not so effectual, you know, when the world rushes in politically, or climate change and COVID, and we have to sort of have our faith in the humanities and literature kind of bolstered, I think, by one another.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And that's, I mean, I think possibly, I know that I went into literature because of that feeling, because of, you know, profound existential loneliness, and finding these voices and feeling as if you can carry around John Milton in your head, if you can carry around Emily Dickinson, then you're not always alone, right? You always have some sort of ghost sort of whispering in your ear. And so that I feel it felt good to remember that. And maybe that sort of segues into your question, Joe, too, which is, I think there are two different people for every author, right? There's the author and then there's the writer. And I think that they're very different people. And I think that these wonderful prizes like this one are magnificent for the author, right? Because the author needs to pay for the next book to be written. But the writer, actually, I think these sorts of things are possibly, you have to protect yourself against them, against not getting them, against getting them in a certain way. You have to keep yourself deeply vulnerable and able to focus on the next thing coming and not look at the past. And I think that it's really hard to make that separation. It's almost impossible to make that separation. But if one doesn't get to the next book, I think. So right now, I'm so happy to be on this tonight. I'm so grateful for this incredible prize. I also struggled all morning with my current work in progress, and who knows if I'll ever get it under control. So the real person is the one struggling within the work, within the words and the text. And the author is the one who gets to walk around in the sunshine.
Well, I certainly feel a sense of kinship with your writing. It seems to me that because you are a really literary writer and you care so much about sentences and constructions and sort of beautifully parallel sentences, almost incantatory prose, which I noticed in Matrix, which I thought was particularly beautifully written. And there are points in the novel and also in your short stories that are just sheerly atmospheric. And the reader thinks, well, I'm actually in this strange place and I can smell this kind of cold air and this moisture. It's the 12th century and I'm in a field and this winter rye has gotten diseased and people are having hallucinations. And it just seems that you've evoked that world so well. And I noticed in one of your interviews, you said, quote, "The setting is the story."
Yes. Well, sometimes it is for me. I think, especially, I didn't know much about the 12th century before going into this book, but I do know what it's like to be an animal in an animal body, right? We are all animals in an animal body. And the way that I think we often understand the world is somatic. That's the first way we take information in, and then we can turn it into vast abstractions, by thinking. But when I'm trying to get into this alien place, these alien landscapes, these things that I don't actually know, I do go back to the things that I do know, which is what a clammy wind feels on my face. I mean, I think we all know that. And what the smell of a field in early March smells like, or, the mud and the bird song and all of these things that come to our really intelligent animal selves first. So I try to remember that. Often I forget, and this is something that you do in editing, or I have to do in editing in sort of rethinking the book itself. But I know that if I don't cue in to the body, then I'm not going to be in the scene as deeply. But I would say that you do that yourself as well. Do you have a practice, Joyce, when you go into scenes like this? Do you do like a meditation before you go into your scenes and you start to feel the somatic self?
Well, I like to run. And I think when I'm running or walking very fast, I sort of prepare for the act of writing by thinking and kind of just evoking that. But I feel that it's almost a kind of hallucinatory vision that comes over us. I do notice that much in your writing. I can see a real kinship between us. And I was just sort of fascinated when I first read Matrix. I have since reread parts of it. But when I was first reading it, I thought that you were kind of entrancing yourself. Mm-hmm. That as you get into it, you're more like your character Marie. She's only 17 in the beginning, and she's somewhat estranged at first, and then she sort of just really gets into it. Mm-hmm. I wondered if that paralleled maybe some of your own experience in writing it.
Yes. Well, like you, I'm a runner, and I run a lot as well. Yes. It's someday we'll run together in the woods or something. It's the only way I know how to stay sane as a human being in this world of ours. And I think you're right. There's this incantatory thing. There's also a rhythm that you get from running, right? It's just a profound rhythm. And I think American literature in particular is deeply dependent upon rhythm. I'm trying to think of, Moby Dick is deeply dependent on the syntactic rhythm. Walt Whitman, I think the greats are all profoundly sensitive to that. And for me to get deeper into the book, I always have to do the sort of running, the sort of rhythmic motion that actually goes into the prose as well. Yes, at the same time. So but it is incantatory. I do this one thing. If there are writers listening, if it's a really particularly heavy lift for a scene, I will take 20 minutes and then I will very, very slowly go through all the senses that my character would be feeling in the moment.
That's very
It's,
interesting. Yeah.
it's gorgeous, right? Because it does get you into this mindset. I think you could set like a breakup scene on a beach or at the top of Mount Everest, and they'd be profoundly different because the world around the people in the scene it changes, right? To be cold, to be relaxed and warm, you're going to say different things, even if your character is the same character. So yeah, it's really important.
You know, what I would say is that there's a muscularity and a physicality in your prose that lends itself to, you mentioned Whitman, which lends itself to which leads to the poetry. And at the same time, as an athlete that you are, you're vulnerable. There's an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I mean, just to circle back to the prize for 1 second, I hope I'm not going to give away a secret, but when the day that I have to notify people that the finalists did not win the prize, it's like the saddest day of my life. I mean, I feel so disappointed for them. But at the same time, when I talk to you, I won't say what you said, but it was like the most emotional moment I've ever experienced with somebody who's received the prize. So, you know, we Joyce, you mentioned a line from an interview that Lauren conducted around enunciation.
Yes.
And maybe, this is kind of your enunciation, Lauren, of the announcement of the prize. So what happens to be the title of this very moving and complex story that came out, I think, in February in the New Yorker. And it's predictably touched a nerve. And so Joyce and I want to talk about, you're such an audacious writer of such tremendous range, but maybe you could help us understand. And there's no way you can say, oh, let's talk about the prototypical Lauren Groff fiction. There is no such thing. There's, Matrix is not Florida. Florida is not Fates and Furies. Annunciation is not Above and, what's that great story? Above and Beyond. But anyway, yeah, I mean, so maybe you could give us a little bit of sense of the origins of the story to the extent that you're conscious of it. I mean, the California you represent, the setting, as Joyce said a second ago, was the story, the California, Redwood City, Mountain View, and the domestic abuse you dramatize, and the quasi fairy tale atmospherics of this amazing story about 4 mothers. This is an amazing story in 20 pages. And at the end, I'm going to ask, was this ever a novel in your head?
No. So I have been trying to tell this story in different forms for a really long time now. And sometimes for me, short stories just don't come the right way the first 40 or 50 times I try to tell them. I knew from the beginning that this was just a short story, or not just. I actually find the short story form probably more difficult in certain ways than the novel form. But a lot of things that happened in this story did happen to me. I did think that I was running away from college in the middle of college, and I went to San Francisco alone, and I stayed in a Chinatown youth hostel, and I had a job at Macy's Union Square. And I was so miserable that when my mom came out to get me, I let myself be taken back. So that's one of the things. But also, my husband and I moved out there after graduation, a couple of years after graduation. And it was, we lived in a little cottage, just like this cottage in the story. And it was one of the most happy and enchanted and weirdly dark times of my life as well. So those two elements went together. For me, a short story can't even begin to breathe as a living thing until it's not just one thing. I think Grace Paley said something I'm going to paraphrase, that a story is not a story unless it's 2 stories. And so I couldn't quite find what the multiple other layers to this story were. And I kept trying and I kept failing and throwing things out and showing my agent, who kept saying, keep going, And then I did remember the mothers of the story and how the story is deeply texturally a story about mothers. And then it came easily. It was only when I remembered my mom coming to save me that the story became a story. And this is, I mean, this is pretty typical for a short story of mine. They live in me for a very long time before I am able to actually put them on the page. And I can try many times and fail many times. I've only been given one story by the gods once in my life, and the rest of them have to sort of linger in the subconscious until one day they fall over my eyes.
But
Well,
not to
that's very-
go, I'm sorry, Joyce. Go on, Joyce. I'm
No, I
sorry.
was going to say it's very interesting because last year Daniel Evans was saying some of the same things. And I was noticing in her work, as in yours, that there's always two times at least. There's a layered sense of time. There's a sense of the person having the experience, like a headlong, could be an adolescent girl, could be a child who's caught up in something much too vast and frightening for her to comprehend. And yet there's a sense that she's connected with a future. She's moving into this future. And that actually is the perspective. It's the future where the writer is kind of remembering this wonderful story called, I think, The Wind, where you seem to be evoking, I mean, you are evoking your own mother and uncle and a grandmother. I mean, by your, I mean the character who's telling the story, not necessarily you. And so too with Annunciation, it's a story, it's retrospective. And Birdie, which I read recently, Birdie is 4 women friends from high school, or they're not exactly friends, but they're getting together and one of them is dying. And the whole story hinges upon a memory that was somewhat repressed and a betrayal that wasn't really acknowledged, decades before. So the story is the opposite of minimalism.
Yeah, that a lot of people have said I'm the opposite. I write the opposite of minimalism. Absolutely, yes. And I'm all right with that. Right, we write what we must write, and yes. I believe in the shifting layers of time. I think my big tutors in short stories, the work that I go back to over and over again are Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro. And what they do, right, is shifting layers of time. The way that if you look at one event from one perspective, it's going to look very different than from something closer, from something further, and playing around with depth and idea and memory and the way that other people see you, right? Or the main character. All of these things go into slightly weirder stories, slightly more difficult stories. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, I was thinking of this piece that was written about you, Joyce, about your unruly genius. I don't know if you, and it reminded the sentence there from Robeson was, you prefer the flood to the levee, which I thought, well, this is Lauren and Joyce. I mean, I think it's the flood.
Well, yes, I suppose so. I'm just going to say parenthetically that I really noticed the wonderful assimilation of Alice Munro in the story Birdie. I mean, it's sort of a typical or archetypal Alice Munro story. We have these women friends, but mostly the focus is on the past and then shifting a perspective so that what was thought in the past was actually incomplete or even wrong. And then we find out right at the moment of the storytelling what really happened. I thought that was really quite masterful. But speaking to what Joe was saying, I think that the whole, emotional, the sort of vortex is basically something like a whirlwind, but we spend a lot of time structuring the work and putting them into sentences and paragraphs. And if you're a novelist, as Lauren and I are, you spend a lot of time in a spatial sense. You divide up a story into sections, years pass. So there is a flood, but it's somewhat a little naive, to think that particularly women writers are just sort of writing in a kind of emotional turmoil. A lot of it's very icy cold. I'm an icy cold and calculating writer.
Huh.
Actually, I'm a formalist and I'm interested in form. And that's sort of the bottom line with me, but I don't necessarily want to be known for that.
Well, let's talk about teaching for a second here. Laurie, you wrote that marvelous essay about Laurie Moore. And who was your teacher? It's a charming, vulnerable, brilliant essay. And at one point you write, fiction isn't life. Fiction is only like life. Fiction is life's metaphor. So I've been thinking about that for days now. Could you talk about you and Lori, or talk about that sentence or that position? Could you?
Sure. I love Lori, and I love her work so deeply. I wrote alone for 3 years between high school between college and grad school, and I had written 3 novels in that time, none of which succeeded in any way at all. And she was also one of my big tutors in trying to learn how to write. I would take stories from Birds of America in particular and just sit with them and try to vivisect them. And unfortunately, when you do that, you lose some of the magic, but I still love to work. So I went to work with her at the University of Wisconsin. And I, she's so elegant and magnificent. And I approached her first class when I had to hand in a short story to her, and I felt profound shame because what I had done was I had just written a pseudo Laurie Moore story. And it was so bad that I think it was the night before I was supposed to hand in the story, I just scrapped it and wrote something completely different. So she was a mentor in the beginning, in that I actually had to consciously write against the influence of Laurie Moore in my own sensibility and my own work, and create something different around the side, because I was so embarrassed to give her a poor ersatz version of her own work. And then, I mean, she's always been, she and I think Grace Paley are the 2 people I've met who have a very a strong voice in the front of my head. It's like a little homunculus sitting there when I'm trying to edit. And I think I hear Lori and I hear Grace Paley sort of saying, like, don't write that. That's horrible. You cannot actually write that. So I think for Lori, she's I imagine pitching my stories in her direction, and a lot of times just the thought of the way that she would receive them makes me change the stories. And she was great. I love her dearly.
Yeah, I love Laura's work also. I didn't realize, I guess I actually had read that essay of yours about Laurie Moore quite a while ago, so I didn't just reread it recently, but this sort of comes back to me. There's a certain winsomeness, a kind of melancholy humor, something very touching and almost heartrending about Laurie's work. It's funny, but at the same time, it's so saturated with melancholy. And I think getting more so as time goes by.
I think so too. And it's the humor acts in probably 10 different ways, right? So it's an invitation to the reader to come into the story. It's a little bit of a shell, right? It's a very vulnerable shell. I mean, it's something that you can see through in a certain way. It is the profound charm, and charm is a weapon, right? I mean, her humor is multi-pronged and deeply vulnerable. And I think that's something that most people respond to when they read Laurie Moore stories, is the profound vulnerability and the softness underneath.
Well, I think you're very courageous and bold. You're not afraid to be really vulnerable, and you don't hide behind wisecracks or witticisms. Basically, you're sort of bearing your heart, like really the ending of Brawler is just so touching. I read it over several times, and I really felt, as I said earlier, that you're such a literary writer that it's almost difficult to translate what you've said into any other words. It's sort of like the language itself casts a spell. It's almost like a musical spell. But this feeling that this girl she's had such a difficult experience, and her mother's having a breakdown, or maybe her mother's actually dying. And she's sort of helplessly thinking ahead to this future where all this is going to come back to her. And I felt when I read it that you were reaching back into some remembered past, perhaps not identical with that. And then you were seeing it from the perspective of the present. And you were making sense of it and kind of redeeming it, even though it was so painful.
Yeah, recently, and I think this is probably not something that I am happy about, but a lot of my stories just don't work unless I really feel extraordinarily vulnerable. They're just not to the level that I want them to be at. And so I do, for that story, for The Wind in particular, and for Annunciation, these are the three stories that I really had to sort of show my bloody beating heart. And it's hard to do that. And it also shuts me down for a little bit afterward too. I can write, but just not very well afterwards. So, but I see that in your work too. You are not afraid to be vulnerable at all. You say you're a formalist, and I would like to be a formalist as well. I mean, I come to this from poetry, but yeah, I think possibly, is it possible that form for you is a way to get to that vulnerability?
I'm not really sure how to answer that. My writing seems to start with a kind of intense feeling. And you spoke of the high emotional pitch. And that is, sometimes it's very tense. It's like a really intense dream. And so then you want to explore that. And then it does have to be put into language. As soon as it gets into language, then it's from a perspective usually of some character. So we're getting into the elements of fiction at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Not to get into the clouds here, but the way you've been talking, I want to ask this question. Is looking across the landscape, the literary landscape, the political landscape, the social landscape, and maybe this is not the most important question in the world, but is this a good time to be a writer? Has there ever been a better time or a worse time?
Oh, I don't even know.
I think we can say that for straight white male writers, it's probably not the best time.
No.
I heard that, Joyce.
I don't know. Is it ever a good time to be a writer? Is it? I don't know.
I don't know either. My students, I think Lauren, you teach also, don't you?
A little bit at Warren Wilson. It's a low residency. I'm a favorite.
Oh, you don't teach in Gainesville? I thought maybe you were. Oh, okay. Well, I say my students, of course, are so hopeful, and they're quite young. My undergraduates at Princeton, in particular, and they're writing this. They are writing their hearts out. They're writing about things that for their generation are very real and timely. And I think that each one of us is writing for our own time, and that there are specific obsessions and things that are happening. So for Joe to ask, is this a good time for a writer? I think it would really matter like who you are. It is probably a very good time for transgender writers who may have been really suppressed or repressed for centuries. It depends upon really your perspective.
And in fairness, I mean, in human history, we are at a point where middle-class people live better than kings and queens for most of history, right? I mean, we have antibiotics, right? We have relatively reliable food systems. We're not going through famines in the United States right now. So in that sense, women are able to be educated and we're able to be literate and to write. So in that sense, I mean, I think that there's a great democratization of literature happening at the moment. There's so many other things impinging on our attention, but there have always been other things impinging on human attention, right? I mean, it could have been in the time of Novelists, plagues or famines as well. So I think it's an okay time for the writer. I don't know about the future because we are not clairvoyants. We don't know what's in the future. I think there's a great deal of anxiety eating at us, but there always has been.
Well,
Oh,
I have some specific questions since we're talking about particularly this novel, which the judges just loved when we were reading. It was such a delight to read something that was almost like prose poetry. So, to step back a little bit from the idea of the inspiration and the atmosphere, do you want to just tell us a little bit about how you got the idea for this set in the 12th century and how you went about it?
So I am a deep nerd and I love Marie de France. I have always loved her. I did a tutorial in college on medieval French. She is the greatest. The lay are wild, right? There are talking stags in them. There are boats that are enchanted. There's a codified love that is so alien to the modern mind, right? Because married love is not supposed to be love, but there is courtly love that is very different, and it's something that people aspire to. And so I just found it fascinating. I did a translation for myself, and it's not very good. But I wanted to write a novel about Marie for 25 years now.
Really? How
Yes,
interesting.
yeah. Oh, I love her so much.
See, that's so interesting. I think other writers and readers would like to know that, because I didn't really know that at all. I thought you worked this up kind of recently, but the fact that it was haunting you for all these years, it gives it that depth.
Oh, I would hope so.
Yeah.
But I mean, you carry things around with you your entire life, and at one point they finally come out, right? So, yeah. This I heard a friend of mine, Dr. Katie Bookish, who's at Notre Dame. She's a brilliant medieval scholar. We were together at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and she gave this lecture that was so impassioned about these nuns and how within this hyper hierarchical, very tight system, they were able to find ways to sort of express their independence and their lack of submission to a lot of the ways that women were treated as vulnerable, especially nuns. Holy women were treated as these secondary citizens. And so I was so fired up sitting in the audience that I was shaking. And I remembered my love of Marie de France. And actually, there was this sort of collision that happened in the audience. And suddenly I saw the book. It's sort of like a secular vision. I saw what I needed to write. Yeah. Sometimes they come.
What
Yeah.
did you, yesterday you said, Lauren, you said you had this vision where your brain exploded into rainbows. Is that what you said in Des Moines the other day?
Yeah, well, that's what happens. It did. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes you're given something and you suddenly see the book that you want to write. And I knew too, and perhaps this is it's too much information too, but I've been thinking about form, like you, Joyce. I love form and I like thinking about it too. And I was thinking about the hyper male narrative arc that we have been taught, the Aristotelian sort of 3-set arc, and right, and it's based on the male orgasm, right? But I was wondering what would happen if one would to write a book, a sort of paying attention to an alternative kind of orgasmic shape, like maybe a female orgasm, right? So it comes in waves and it's intensifying. And so the formal structure of that book is based on the alternative to Freytag's pyramid male orgasm.
But that's so interesting. And I think that readers and writers are really intrigued by that, because the average person, isn't going to sit down and work to structure something, but the average person has stories to tell and is quite, people are so excited to hear gossip, but a writer will take that to another level where we're willing to spend frustrating time, many hours, trying to figure out what is the best way to present the material, which is obviously what you did. And you also did a lot of research, I would guess.
Oh, so much. Yes. Yeah. But that's joyous, right? I mean, that's part of the process. Reading is part of writing. Of course, you cannot write a book without reading a great deal. And I wanted to read toward a fuller understanding of medieval humanity, because I think that perhaps it's Monty Python is to blame, but I think a lot of our preconceived ideas about the Middle Ages is that it was just really dark, dirty, short-lived, miserable, and holy. I mean, but I wanted to show humans as humans are. I mean, we always have had a huge, wonderful sense of humor and delight and ecstasy in the body, and joy in ritual and community. I mean, these are all things that I think are pretty much universal in human experience. And so to do research toward blowing up this very flattened, preconceived idea about what humans of that time were like, that's sort of how I pitched my research, but I did a great deal.
And you spent time in a convent, and it's talking about research. You got up the Catholic world, and you got up the convent world. I lived in a novitiate myself in the 13th century, not the 12th century. But I mean, it felt so real what you were doing, and so accurate. And I'm thinking, wow, this is impressive.
That's so impressive, yeah. Well, we've all read Chaucer, and there's a certain bawdiness and earthiness, and a delight in the physicality of the world in Chaucer. But I think overall, as you say, that people have a very distorted and reductive view of the past overall.
I mean, even the recent past, right? I mean, I think people tend to flatten as they think about things in the past, and possibly it is a goal of fiction to work against that flattening, that reductiveness.
So I have just one more question. Was Marie de France a big woman? Is that actually historically true?
So we don't know anything about her. I mean, they're just suppositions. We know that she may have been an abbess. We know that she was literate in multiple languages, and she was a big fan of Ovid because she retold a couple of Ovid stories in the lay. But we truly don't know anything about her, because at the time, really, the only women put into the historical record were women who are relationally interesting, because they were the daughters of kings, or the wives of kings, right? Or even saints, right? And you know, to be a saint in the Catholic Church, there's a huge layer of mythology that's like spackled onto you. So who knows who the actual people are? So no, we don't know. But so what I did actually, and this was one of the more fun things that I did in preparation, is I went through the books that we know for sure that she wrote, the lay and then the fables, and I withdrew from them the most living images and the places that I felt that I could feel a human being underneath the surface, writing, a flesh and blood person. And at the end, I had this piece of flash fiction that was it was beautiful and so strange. And I was able to extrapolate from that sort of a living person. That was my vision of who this person was. But, you know, we know for a fact that this person, just because she writes about it, knew a great deal about sex, and a surprising amount based on our supposition that she might have been an abbess. We knew that she's deeply in love with textures, right? So like, in almost every one of her lay, there's some sort of texture that she sort of luxuriates in. The sables and the velvets, right? And well, maybe not velvet because it wasn't invented back then, but the silks. And so there are these things that we do know. And so I knew that she was someone who was deeply invested in her physical body. She was, and so in my mind, she was very large, but who knows? Yeah.
Well, it seems very, very plausible.
Thank you. Not confident.
Everything about it. And the adventures that she has, and just sort of moving through her own destiny, which she's only 17 in the beginning, and the years go by very quickly. I was wondering, was the novel actually longer, and maybe you cut it back a bit?
No, so from the beginning, I knew the structure had to be somewhat episodic. It was a little bit like a rosary. Rosaries are invented in the 14th century, but in my mind, it was rosary shaped. It was female orgasm shaped, and so it had to be swift and sort of rippling the whole way through. Yeah,
Are you a Catholic?
I'm not. No, no. Yeah, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages is pretty wildly different from the Catholic Church now. And so that gave me a foothold because I could sort of scan what the difference is. Yeah.
Well, you said the other day that actually the sex that was going on in the Abbey was not really sex because it wasn't involving a man.
Well, according to the men who codified what sin was at the time, that's right. The sex happening between women because there's no penis involved wasn't seen as a sin because there was no penis involved. So
I think, didn't Queen Victoria say something a little bit like that? She could understand, or they could understand in the Victorian world, male homosexuality, which was just so obscene and horrible, but they didn't really think that there could even be female homosexuality. So there is no law against it because it just seems so improbable.
Right. There's great glee to see these holes in history, right? To see with a modern mind and to look back and to say, oh, that's very innocent. Yeah.
Lauren, I have another question. As Joe said, everything you do is just so different. I mean, Florida is so completely different from Matrix. And the most recent short stories I've seen in the New Yorker are actually different also. So I'm wondering what you're working on now. Are you working on a novel?
Yes. So I see Matrix as one in a triptych of novels about women and God and climate change, the things that I really want to. And so the next one will come out next year. It's about 1609 in Jamestown, and it's sort of like a female Robinson Crusoe. And I had so much fun with this one, Joyce, because I got to go back to Shakespeare and get Shakespearean rhythm and
Wonderful.
oh, it was so glorious. And King James rhythm, because the King James Bible is the most gorgeous manuscripts out there. It's just so splendid. And then the third one that I'm working on and failing and crying about every single day is set now. And I'm trying to track the way that religion has failed us when it comes to our stewardship of the planet and our stewardship of women and people who identify as women. And so we'll see if the third one ever actually gets written, but I'm trying.
Where specifically is it set?
Florida.
Oh.
Which
Yes.
raises the question, anything interesting happening in Florida these days, Lauren, that I haven't heard much about Florida.
It's Florida. The answer is of course. I mean, I don't know if there are any, men high on some sort of strange drug eating the faces off of homeless people that happened a couple of years ago. But yeah, a lot of interesting weird stuff is happening now. I think that it's being drowned out by wars, assaults on basic human bodily autonomy and civil rights. Yeah. But Florida's as weird as it's always been.
But you, as you say, it's where you want to live.
No, it's not.
Well, wait a second. You said wait a second. Well, what does it give you? What does it give you to be in Florida?
I have come to a truce with the state. I'm here because I can do my job anywhere, and my husband has to be here, and I love him. But it is not the place that I want to be, for sure. But I've come to I mean, I like how it makes me feel like an alien, right? And I don't think writers can write from the inside. I think they have to write from the outside. And so I will always feel like an alien here. Yeah, no, I don't know. But I also, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven, right? I don't know if I'd even be happy being in Paris, which is my dream. So who knows?
Well,
Can you go running every day? I mean, it's not too hot?
I have to. Yes.
And,
Yeah. I
and
go
there
running
and there are
every day.
snakes everywhere, right? When you
There's
run, that's
snakes everywhere. Absolutely. Snakes all over the place. Um, yeah, no, there's a prairie, Joyce. It's actually very beautiful. There are bison and wild horses and birds that I'm sure I have no idea what their names are, but they're vast and strange. And so that's the best part of living in Florida, is running out to the prairie and seeing all this wildlife.
No, I think I've seen that. Yeah, I have a stepdaughter who lives in Gainesville. She's a doctor, and she's on the staff of the medical school, and then her husband is a physicist. And we had visited them. I think we went, I don't remember the name of this place that we went to, but it was like a national park or something.
Probably Payne's Prairie. That's where we take people.
Yeah.
Did you see alligators? A lot of alligators?
Oh, sure. We saw all sorts of things, but it comes back to me sort of dimly now when you use the word prairie. Most
Mhm.
people don't associate that word with Florida.
No, not at all. No, no, that's a Midwestern word for most people, but
Let me encourage everybody. Pretty soon we'll be taking questions, so fill up the Q&A box, please. Feel encouraged. Let me take a quick turn here. So Danielle Evans, our previous winner, and your friend wrote, I often say being a writer is like being the world's worst therapist and having yourself as a patient, constantly being astounded by your own predictable motivations. And the reason I like to talk about that for just a second, I'm inspired by something you said, Joyce, that when a writer is interviewing another writer, all questions are sort of variations upon, are you as crazy as I am?
What is your schedule? People always
You're
ask me
right.
that. You know, like who would care about that? And yet people seem to care.
Well, wait a second. So Joyce, what's interesting, Lauren talked about her writing process, not to go writer conferencing too much, but say you have a whole different process when you write a novel from when you write a short story. And then you write longhand for novels. And well, go ahead, tell us. You have a whole different process. Can you pull the curtain back a little bit?
I don't have a different process. Basically, it's really all the same. I write in longhand. I have all sorts of notes and things. I just write sort of crazy things. I scribble, and I don't know what Lauren does, but so I go running, and then I think about things and get into this other world and see like abbreviated sort of cinematic chapters of what I'm working on. Then when I come home, I take notes, and at some weird mystical moment, I put it on the word processor, and put it into print. But I don't do that too soon. It's so loose and flexible when it's in the handwriting.
But now, Lauren, you throw away manuscripts after you finish whole drafts, right? And you start all over again.
Yeah, I read longhand as well. I love hearing that. I think there are only a few of us who do this, but yeah, every draft is longhand up until the very, very last draft. And so I like to write the first few drafts quickly, just to be in this long sustained dream of the work and to understand the rhythm of it and to understand sort of the scope of it. But at a certain point, I think for Matrix, it was the 8th or 9th draft that I'd thrown out and started over. Really? I can't read my own handwriting either. I have such egregious handwriting. It's horrible.
Do you mean you start over from the beginning?
I do. Yeah. Draft after draft after draft. But then on the last draft, I try to read my handwriting. And what I get this from Anne Sexton, actually, because Diane Middlebrook wrote this amazing biography of Anne Sexton. And I think at one point she was really shaky because she was on lithium. And I think she was writing the poem that ended up being rowing toward God. And the first verb that she used was running toward God, which is not as interesting, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so there's this crack between what the brain wanted and what the brain actually saw. And I think that crack is really interesting. And so trying to reread my handwriting and put it on the screen opens up wild new word choices that I probably wouldn't have intentionally made.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions. Karen wants to know what your plans are for your residency in October. And so do you, Lauren. So we're still planning that. And we will, those will all be announced in time, but it'll be mid-October for sure. She'll be in the Bay Area.
Where will Lauren be staying?
At Cal, somewhere either at the Josephine Miles house or at this wonderful hotel, the Berkeley City Club. And it'll be, and Joyce, you're always welcome to come join us.
No, I was in Berkeley for many semesters, but I never saw the Josephine Miles house. I'd only heard about it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. I have great memories of it. Josephine Miles was a wonderful person. Yeah, my mentor. Okay, what else we have here? Reading the work of Lauren and Joyce is enlightening, close to a religious experience. From Michael, what principles or themes do you hope your acolytes take from your writing? Which other writers come to mind as, quote, modern prophets? I'm glad you guys are here to answer that question. Who are the prophets?
Well, I think it's always, one always hesitates to say anything because we have writer friends and we don't want to offend people who we're not mentioning. So that always sort of makes me just pause, a long pause.
Okay.
One person who's a prophet is Anne Carson. I think that she's absolutely a prophet. She just, I just read something by her in the London Review of Books, and it was about her snow falling and her mother dying. And the way that her brain moves, it moves in such different tracks from my own. I would sit with her and read anything she writes. I mean, I think she's extraordinary. Let me think, who else? I mean, there's so many, right? I think that's.
Okay, this is an interesting question. What do you read for inspiration? If that's a valid construct, before you start a project, during one. Do you read stuff? Do you warm up by reading Walt Whitman or Anne Sexton or Anne Carson? Or
I read a lot of poetry before I begin. Yeah, and I think I read poetry because I think that what poets do formally is really fascinating, and we can learn a great deal from it. And the precision of the language is always the precision toward which I'm trying to sort of move my prose. Yeah, I almost every day I'll read maybe like 15 poems, something like that before beginning. Joyce, what do you read before you write?
Well, because of the internet and the accessibility of poetry, one can just sort of sit at the computer, like the Poetry Foundation poem of the day, comes along. And there are many single poems that I find myself reading that I might click onto them and go and read more by the same poet. Ordinarily, if I were just sitting in a chair in a desk somewhere, I wouldn't have that kind of infusion almost out of the void, So that's, maybe there are not very many wonderful things about the internet, but that really is where there's this constant refreshing and renewal of poetry that you didn't even know about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let me raise a subject that is on your Twitter feed lately, Laura, actually on yours too, Joyce, and that is you've been defamed. Your book has been banned, and I'm wondering, is there anything new going on here, or is this the same old incel projection kind of stuff going on, or is there some attempt to protect children or something like that? I mean, what's going on here? Anything new in this book banning rage we're in right now?
It's probably not new. The 1950s was a time of great repression, and it's mostly political posturing. I think we feel that it's hypocritical and gestural, and that it's sort of riling and rabble rousing to get a certain cohort to vote in a certain way. But the people who are doing it, I think, are not really sincere. That's what's particularly galling about it.
This is the first time I know of that I've been banned. It
was Fates and Furies, right? That's what.
Right. It's the sex. the sex in it. And I think it's also, I mean, you look at that list and you just know that the person who made the list has not read many books.
Including your book. Well, including your book, I don't think they actually read. They
Oh,
may
no.
flip through, or they hear from somebody else, oh, this is a shocking book,
Mhm.
but they don't really read themselves. That's why I mean it's so hypocritical. And that's
Mhm.
what's maddening about it. We can see clearly, it's very transparent how politicians wave these red flags to make people angry, like about abortion as an issue. Abortion really wasn't a political issue for a long time. It's just sort of relatively recently, I think since Ronald Reagan, all these things just come to us and they seem very, very performative and hypocritical.
Mhm. Especially since I was a relatively pious child in my Presbyterian upbringing, and I remember it's just sitting there droning. The pastor or the preacher would like sort of drone on, and I'd grab the Bible, and in the Bible there's incest, right? There's rape, there's murder, there's brother murder. I mean, there's every kind of shocking thing you could possibly imagine. And so the mere idea that these people are trying to protect children by limiting books, modern books, as if they can't get it elsewhere, as if they can't get it, from the Bible. It's stupid.
Well, also can't get it from video games or from the internet. I mean, how many people are going to be corrupted by reading your novel or anything of mine when there's just millions and millions of people? It's so, as I say, it's very hypocritical. And in many instances, it's racist and it's anti-Semitic. Picking on something that Toni Morrison has written that would have a very limited appeal. I mean, Toni Morrison is a very great literary demanding writer. People read her the way they read Faulkner. She's not going to be corrupting huge swaths of people.
Mm-hmm. I read Lolita when I was 13 years old, and I probably shouldn't have. It definitely changed my idea of sexuality in very interesting ways. But if any adult had tried to take it out of my hands, that would have made it much more compelling, right?
Exactly.
That's what these people are doing. They're actually making books more compelling to children, and it doesn't make any sense. It's very racist. It's a dog whistle, as are most things that the GOP are doing.
Dog whistle, that's right.
Yeah.
Let me call out a book that Joyce wrote called A Book of American Martyrs, which is an astonishing novel about, some of the subjects you're talking about. An abortion provider is murdered. And this is one of the great novels of our times. So which you can't see with my camera.
You can't see it.
Yeah,
You
sorry.
put it in front of your face. There you go.
There it is.
There it is, yeah.
There it is. Let me see what other questions. Here's a question. Would you mind sharing how you know when a story or a novel is finished? Any advice on revision? How do you know a story or novel is finished, and when do you know it?
Well, I can say a few things. Usually the novel just hangs around for a long time in my consciousness. In the old days, before computers, when we had typewriters, it would literally have a manuscript I would put in a drawer sometimes for a year and might take out and look at, and then I might revise it. And there's just a feeling, it's very intuitive, I think. There's a feeling that there's one day when you go through it for how many times, one day you sort of have a feeling that's it. It's very intuitive.
Mm-hmm. And it takes a while to train your ear to know when the story or novel at hand is finished, right? So I think one will always have a platonic ideal of the book toward which you're writing, and we will probably never hit it, which is fine, because that's the whole purpose of a platonic ideal. But there is a moment after you've done this work enough where you say, well, this is as close as I can possibly bring it myself. And then you give it to other people and they can maybe help you bring it a little bit closer. But nothing is ever perfect. I think a lot of people get caught up in this idea that a story has to be perfect before it goes out. And if that is the mindset, then no stories will ever go out, because no work of literature is perfect. And in fact, a work of literature is only interesting in its imperfection, I would say. So
Did you
yeah.
did you always have the title Matrix in mind?
Yes, actually, people fought me for it because of Keanu Reeves.
Oh my God.
I love the word matrix. It means so many things in every single academic discipline, right? In computer science, in geology, in even the making of stuff, right? A record, the first record that other records are pressed from is the matrix record. So it's a word that's had about 15 different fragmented meanings that I wanted the reader to read the book through. But in Sweden, for instance, they kept matrix, but they fought me on it when I went over there. In other places, they fought me on it. Yeah.
You can see why Florida is called Florida. I mean, it's just very, very concise and very descriptive. But matrix is actually, it's not inevitable. I mean, it's not a title that anyone else maybe would have thought of.
Possibly. I mean, I also wanted to take the word back a little bit. I love the Wachowski sisters, but I have to say, I think of the mother of all things, not in terms of guns, but in terms of creation and in terms of love. Not guns, not red pills, not blue pills. All right. I wanted to sort of expand the idea of what the word was in the popular consciousness.
And what's the title of your the second in the trilogy?
The Vaster Wilds.
Wilds.
Yeah, it's a modification of a line in The Tempest, which is the vasty deeps.
Oh,
yeah. But I thought vasty, Americans wouldn't know what vasty meant, so vaster was suggested.
Very interesting. Well, there's something talismanic and magical about just the perfect title.
Oh my gosh, your titles are so good. How do you come up with them?
You have to fight her publisher, the vicissitudes, right, Joyce?
I don't know. They just seem to match, but sometimes I have changed them. Like Vicissitudes of Time Travel was the title that I had for years in a novel, literally about time travel. But I had to change it to Hazards of Time Travel. My publisher thought the word vicissitudes is so evidently hard to look at. Marketing people do have something to say, so I kind of gave into that. But hazards is a nice word with the Z's. Hazards, I like that word also.
It's a good rhythm too, the hazards of time.
I do like that, yeah.
Well, in fact, of course, we have the Jack Hazard fellowships for high school teachers who are creative writers. And one of the things, it resonates that and he was a colorful figure, and it's something that we have a lot of hope for in the future. So here's a question about animals. Lauren, I know you have a dog. Joyce, famous cats. Do your animals help you write? Seems like you're both big animal lovers. Do they find their way into your writing as well? Lauren, you have lots of dogs.
I have one dog.
Well, no, but in the fiction, in your stories, I mean, there's a dog up here, and there she is.
Hi.
She was hoping that she would be called.
Oh, she's so beautiful, and she's so unhappy right now.
Well, if she was really unhappy, she'd be showing it. So she's not unhappy. She's a Maine Coon.
Oh,
gorgeous, gorgeous.
And you have a dog?
I have a Labradoodle. She's goofy. I have a goofy muse.
But you don't let her in, I think you said.
I do, but she would be snoring, and it would be so annoying.
Labradoodles are so good-natured and so intelligent.
So sweet. Yeah. Luckily, she's more lab than poodle in her mind, and so she's not that smart. She's good, but she's wonderful. I like to have her at my feet because there is something about if you're stuck and you say why you're stuck out loud to an animal, something comes back to you, and it comes back to you in terms of energy, I think.
That's
Okay,
what we
Olive.
we tell ourselves, well, the energy you get from a cat is usually very inert, like the cat is so completely asleep and indifferent. There's something kind of wonderful about that indifference.
Okay, let me see what else we have here. Anyway, okay, looks like we're pretty good here. Is there anything else we should talk about? Anything we forgot to bring up?
Well, Joe, do you have some dogs, don't you?
Yes,
Do you-
they are whippets.
Oh, yes, that's right. I remember the whippets. They're very special dogs.
Well, they're real dogs. They get muddy. They chase rats. We live sort of in the country, and they go after
They like to run.
35 miles an hour.
Do you run with a dog?
Oh, yeah, I used to run 35 miles an hour in my dreams.
But
No, but
I've
they-
seen people run. I've seen people running with whippets, and of course, the whippets are running. The whippets are so happy when they're running. There's something
Well,
wonderful
they're-
about.
and they're named Ava and Raylan after an Elmore Leonard story. That was in the television Justified. That was anyway. It's a great story that was made into a TV show.
No, it was a
And they-
wonderful series. Well, let me ask Lauren something kind of mundane. Do you watch any series on television like Yellowstone or Peaky Blinders or whatever?
Yeah, a few. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the ones that I've loved recently. I try not to get too involved because then the reading goes out the window. But
Right.
what did I love? I love Severance. I thought that was really good. Did you
Severance.
see it?
I haven't read
Oh.
that, but I should. Severance. Yeah, it's very
Yes.
well known.
Yes, yeah, it was a great show. And then just in terms of returning me back to my 13-year-old awkward self, I love Pen 15. I thought that what they
Never
did was
saw that.
genius. It's so good. How about you? What do you watch? What have you watched?
Well, I mentioned Peaky Blinders, which I thought was quite brilliant. And many people in this country, I think, have never heard of it. It's BBC, and it's actually very, very wonderful, and it kind of ingeniously uses contemporary music. It's set in post-World War I, Birmingham, England, and it's about Irish gypsies. It's a crime family story. And it's interesting how Yellowstone, which I'm watching sort of episodically, that's another crime family story, very timely and very much about America.
Haven't heard of. I watched one episode of Peaky Blinders, and then I haven't heard of Yellowstone, so I have to write this down.
And you've been on a Al Pacino run recently, Joyce. You've been talking about him.
Well, a friend and I, beginning in about March 2020, in the pandemic, we watched movies separately. We were all sort of locked down in our houses, and we went through like the classics of American screwball comedies and noirs. And so I've just seen, decades of these wonderful movies that I would never have seen otherwise. It's just that we were all sort of locked down in our houses.
How about a favorite book that's on your desk right now? That you're yearning to tell somebody about?
This isn't my actual desk. My actual desk is upstairs.
Okay.
Let me see. Oh, well, look what's right behind me. Here we go.
Oh, that's nice.
Amazing.
That was made into it's made into a movie that was sponsored by Netflix.
That's
Oh my
right.
goodness.
Andrew
right.
Dominic. The movie is very interesting. It's a kind of elliptical film. I mean, it's not literally the novel. It's just a distillation of the novel. But Andrew Dominic is almost like a feminist writer. He's mimicking the feminist perspective in a very interesting way. But here's something that I've been looking at. I've been reading women's slave narratives of, obviously the 19th century, and because I'm doing some research. Wonderful biography of Sojourner Truth by Nell Painter. I'm learning so much. I mean, we think we know, I mean, we do know a fair amount about slavery, but you learn so much more, like the nitty gritty and daily life. And it's the difference between some slave households, like in the North, and how different it was from the typical Southern plantation. Just really very edifying.
Nell Painter is such a magnificent writer.
Yes,
She's
isn't
so
she?
good.
Yeah. She was my colleague and friend at Princeton. And then she retired early and she wanted to take up painting, which she has done, I believe. Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Well, we should be tidying up here. Is there any last thoughts you'd like to share with all these people who have gathered virtually?
I'd like to say I'm profoundly grateful for this. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone who's involved with this. Thank you, Joyce, for putting your name on such a moving tribute.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I really loved reading and rereading your work. It was really great. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
So a heads up that in October, as I said, there will be numerous events and parties.
Oh, good.
We throw very good parties at the Literary Project, and we'll be announcing that if you go to our website, and which is newliteraryproject.org. It's been great, and I think it's time for us to sign off, but thank you everyone for coming. It's been great getting to know you, and appreciate, there's our website, just showed up there. Thank you, Jen and Busby Group. All right then.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very much.
Joyce. You're the best.
Thank
See
you.
ya.